Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're looking at something pretty controversial, I guess you could say, Western democracy in Africa. But more specifically, we're going to be honing in on some strong opinions from former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, and he has some thoughts. Let's just say that.
Yeah, and the timing of this is really interesting too, right? I mean, we've got this whole wave of coups happening in West Africa, literally right on Nigeria's doorstep. And then you've got Nigeria itself, which is, currently experiencing its longest stretch of democratic rule since independence. So it kind of makes you wonder, right? Is this like a stable democracy, or is it teetering on the edge of something else?
Right. It begs the question for sure. So to get into all of this, we're going to be looking at an article from Restore Nigeria News. It's from November 1st, 2024, and the title is pretty blunt. Western democracy not working for us. Obasanjo insists.
Yeah, he's not mincing words there. And in the article, he basically comes right out and says that Western democracy is not serving Africa's interests. And on top of that, it's even failing in the Western countries where it originated.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because he's even citing concerns that have been raised by the British themselves about their own system. The article actually quotes Obasanjo directly. It's from a speech he gave at a university event. And he says, "I have consistently emphasized that Western liberal democracy is not serving our interests. It is failing even in the countries that introduced it to us. The British themselves have raised concerns. It is imperative that we reconsider our approach to democracy."
Wow. I mean, when you hear it laid out like that, it really does give you pause. I mean, if the birthplace of Western democracy is having second thoughts, what does that mean for a place like Africa
Hmm.
with its own unique history and cultures and challenges? I mean, is it possible that trying to like force fit a system that was designed for a totally different context, is that actually part of the problem?
Yeah, that's the big question,
Right.
right? And Obasanjo doesn't stop there. He actually goes on to propose an alternative. He's calling for a democracy that is deeply rooted in African cultural values.
And that's where things get even more interesting, I think.
Right?
Because when you start to unpack those values, things like unity, collaboration, dialogue, collective action, they sometimes clash with like the fundamental principles of Western democracy.
Right.
Like think about it, Western systems, they often emphasize individual rights, competition.
Right, almost like two completely different operating systems trying to run on the same machine.
Exactly. And Obasanjo actually alluded to this in a previous statement where he called Western liberal democracy a government of a select few over the entire populace, basically saying it's just not a good fit for Africa's diverse cultural landscape.
Okay, so we're starting to see his argument take shape here. But we can't ignore what's happening on the ground right now. We've had 8 coups take place in West and Central Africa just in the past 4 years. Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, Niger. All of them Nigeria's neighbors, by the way. They're currently under military rule. That's a pretty stark illustration of how fragile democracy can be.
It really is. And it makes Obasanjo's critique that much more urgent. He's
Huh.
basically saying, look, this Western model isn't delivering. We need to consider a system that's more in tune with who we are as Africans.
And here's the twist. Obasanjo himself was both a military head of state and a 2-time democratically elected president of Nigeria. He led the country through a transition from military rule to civilian rule. And there are some Nigerian officials who are actually accusing him of having a hand in creating the very system that he's now criticizing.
It's almost like he's saying, I helped build this house, and now I'm telling you the foundation might be cracked. I mean, talk about a unique perspective. It really highlights the complexities of these transitions, and how someone's views can evolve based on their experiences. Makes you wonder, what did he see during his time in power that led him to this conclusion?
And that brings us to Nigeria today. Like we said, the country is experiencing its longest stretch of democratic rule since independence in 1960. So is Obasanjo just being overly pessimistic?
Yeah.
Or is he onto something? Is this a moment to celebrate? Or is there genuine cause for concern, especially with everything happening in the surrounding countries?
Well, that's what we're going to try to unpack, right? Is this just a grumpy old leader? Or is this a canary in the coal mine? Not just for Nigeria, but for the whole idea of democracy itself.
All right, let's get into it. I mean, it's like he's seen something behind the curtain, maybe something that most of us haven't even considered. But before we get too deep into all that, I think we need to zoom out for a second and remember that Africa is a big place. It's a whole continent.
Right, it's not a monolith. To assume that one single model of democracy can fit all 54 countries in Africa, that's kind of naive, wouldn't you say?
Totally. It'd be like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
And this is where I think Obasanjo's idea of incorporating African cultural values gets really intriguing. It's about tailoring the system to the people and not the other day around.
Yeah.
Well, what does that even look like? Like, that's easy to say, but putting it into practice, it seems incredibly complex.
It is, and there are definitely some potential downsides to think about too. Like some people might say that putting too much emphasis on like communal harmony and consensus, that could actually stifle dissent, make it harder for people to voice their concerns, especially if those concerns go against traditional norms.
That's a good point. Like, if everyone's always striving for consensus, does that mean the tough decisions never get made?
Yeah.
Or like,
Yeah.
does it create an opening for those in power to manipulate the system?
Yeah, those are serious questions for sure. And then there's the whole question of how do you balance tradition with the need for progress and modernization? I mean, Africa's changing so rapidly,
Right.
especially with technology and globalization. So can a system that's rooted in traditional values actually adapt to those shifts?
It's like trying to keep a boat steady while navigating rapids, right? You need a strong foundation,
Wow.
but you also need to be flexible and adapt to the changing currents.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole debate so important. It's not about finding like the one right answer. It's about acknowledging the complexities and recognizing that there are trade-offs with any system.
It says less about right or wrong
Uh-huh.
and more about most suitable. And that probably changes over time, too.
Mm.
But I have to say, even with all those challenges, there is something really appealing about the idea of a democracy that feels truly homegrown, like one that reflects the unique spirit and values of the people it represents. Maybe that's naive, but I think it's worth exploring.
I get that. And remember, Obasanjo is not saying we should just throw out Western democratic principles altogether. He's suggesting we adapt them, infuse them with elements that resonate with the African context.
So maybe it's not an either situation, but more about finding a middle ground, some kind of hybrid model that takes the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And who knows? Maybe by experimenting and innovating in this way, maybe Africa could actually offer some valuable lessons to other democracies around the world, ones that are facing their own unique challenges.
That's a really interesting thought. What if, by trying to adapt democracy to its own context, what if Africa ends up pushing the whole concept of democracy forward?
It's possible. I mean, it speaks to the fact that democracy isn't some static finished product. It's a process of evolution and refinement.
So let's play this out for a minute. Let's say we were to actually try and design a system of government infused with African values.
Hmm.
What might that look like in practice? Like, how would decisions get made? How would power be distributed? Would we see more emphasis on consensus building and less on the kind of adversarial politics that we see in a lot of Western systems?
Those are all excellent questions. And it's important to keep in mind that there's no single blueprint for what this would look like. I mean, Africa, as we've said, is not a homogenous entity, so different countries and communities, they would likely adapt these principles in ways that reflect their own unique histories and cultural norms.
So instead of trying to create like a one-size-fits-all model, it's more about providing a framework, a set of guiding principles. That can then be adapted and implemented in different ways, almost like a shared language of governance, but with different dialects.
I love that analogy. And within that framework, you could imagine a system that places a greater emphasis on communal decision-making processes. So, for example, instead of relying solely on elections and majority rule, you might see more community councils or elders playing a role in shaping policies or resolving disputes.
That's fascinating. But what about the role of the individual in a system like that? Would individual rights be sacrificed in the pursuit of collective harmony? Or could you find a way to balance both?
That's where it gets really tricky. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but one potential approach might be to reframe the whole relationship between the individual and the community.
So instead of seeing them as competing forces, maybe you see them as interdependent. The well-being of the individual is inextricably linked to the well-being of the community.
Exactly. And within that framework, individual rights could be understood as those that contribute to the overall strength and harmony of the community. So it's not about suppressing individuality, it's about channeling it in ways that benefit the collective good.
So rather than emphasizing individual rights in opposition to the group, you're emphasizing individual contributions to the group. It's a subtle shift, but it's potentially really profound.
It is, and it highlights the fact that this isn't about romanticizing the past or rejecting modernity. It's about taking a critical look at the systems we have and looking for solutions that are truly responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people they are meant to serve.
So acknowledging that there is no one-size-fits-all model of democracy and that each society has the right even the responsibility to shape a system that works best for them.
That's a powerful idea. And it goes beyond these simplistic narratives of like West versus the rest or tradition versus modernity. It lets us engage with the complexities of democratic evolution in a much more nuanced and productive way.
And maybe, just maybe, by having these conversations, by daring to experiment and innovate, maybe we can discover new pathways to a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Now, wouldn't that be something?
Yeah, it really makes you think, huh? Like, what if we've been too focused on exporting a very specific model of democracy instead of focusing on exporting the core principles that make democracy work, things like fairness, accountability, giving people a voice. Maybe those principles could be embodied in different ways, shapes that actually fit the cultural landscape better.
I mean, that's the beauty of democracy, isn't it? It's not like this rigid structure. It's a set of living, breathing ideas that can be interpreted and applied in so many different ways.
But here's the thing that I keep coming back to. Even if we came up with the most brilliant, culturally sensitive system, what's to stop it from being corrupted? Power corrupts.
Yeah.
And that's a human problem, not just an African problem.
You're not wrong. I mean, systems are only as good as the people who run them. And that's why, regardless of what form democracy takes, the real key is fostering a culture of transparency, accountability, active citizenship.
So it's not enough to just design a good system. You have to constantly nurture it, tend to it like a garden or something.
Yeah.
Because those weeds of corruption, they can sprout up anywhere.
That's a great analogy. And that vigilance has to come from both the top down and the bottom up. Leaders need to be held accountable, of course, but citizens also need to be engaged and informed and willing to speak out against injustice.
And this is where I think it gets really relevant for everyone listening, because these are the same principles that apply to any democracy, anywhere in the world. It's a good reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires participation, critical thinking, a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Couldn't agree more. And maybe Obasanjo's critique, even if you don't agree with all of it, it serves as a valuable wake-up call. It forces us to question those assumptions we have about democracy, to look beyond what's familiar, and really consider what does it actually mean to govern ourselves in a way that reflects our values and serves the collective good.
So maybe the real takeaway here isn't about finding the perfect model, but about cultivating a certain mindset, a commitment to continuously questioning and adapting and striving for something better.
And who knows, maybe by embracing that spirit of experimentation and innovation, maybe we can unlock the true potential of democracy, not just in Africa, but everywhere.
That's something I'll be thinking about for a while, and I hope it's something that you'll consider too. What does democracy actually mean to you? What kind of world do you want to live in? And what role are you willing to play in shaping that future? These are big questions, but they're worth asking. And the answers, well, those are up to each and every one of us.
Well said. It's been another fascinating deep dive, and I hope our listeners leave today with more questions than answers, because that's how we learn, that's how we grow, and that's how we move forward.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time. Ready to dive into another thought-provoking topic. But until then, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations going.